Hey guys, welcome back to Clutch Takes, and today we're going to be talking about fantasy trade and draft help as fantasy season is right around the corner. The first tip in the fantasy draft is to prioritize left wing early, as there isn't many high-end left wingers, and you're not going to get Alexander Ovechkin if you don't have a first pick in the top 5, so you need to prioritize left wing early.
Good left wings are rare to come by, so get them earlier in the draft so you won't miss out later. And centers, people have the notion that there's not much, but honestly there's a lot. So you can get a good quality center later in the draft, like in round 5 or 6. This will make your team more all-round and better than the other teams in the league.
Tip number 2 is to get 2 good starters, as only 16 teams make the playoffs. And you want to have a good goalie because goalies can carry you since they can get you a lot of fantasy points.
And of those 16 teams with the starters, I would rather get a goalie that starts 60 games than a 1A, 1B because that will equal more points. Also, the reason why you want them on playoff teams because playoff teams equal more wins. So more wins would get you more points. Even if they're not a necessarily good goalie, wins come a long way.
Going off the point of drafting goalies on good teams, you also want to draft players on good teams as well, because those teams are going to be less likely to go through ruts, and you want your team to be most consistent as possible, and this will best lead to that.
Also, a reason not to draft players on bad teams is because the greatest players can look like the worst players on fantasy. As I got McDavid on my team, and since Edmonton was in struggles like throughout the whole year last year, he would have like a goal and 2 assists, and he would lose all of those points because of a -3.
Tip number 4 is to don't always go for need if better player is available. And what we mean by this is that if you need defense, left wing or right wing, but a 6 center is there that's better than them all, you go ahead and pick the center, as trades can always happen and you want your team to just be the best as possible with the best players.
And also, to add on to that, you can use those players as trade bait because other people have needs. And I'd rather have like a really good center than like go for a need of like a mediocre defense, because you could either get that defenseman in the next round or you can trade that center for even better defenseman.
The last tip we have for you for the fantasy draft is to pay attention to later rounds, and I can't stress how important this is because there's steals found all the time in later rounds. If you believe it or not, in my draft, Braden Point was left unpicked, and you gotta pay attention because you can find a steal in later rounds, not just garbage players on waivers.
As well as you can use those players like in rounds like 10 to 16. Like, I know people don't think those are important because they're like most likely bench players, but like Dan said, you can find steals, but you can also use those players as trade bait because you want the best player available so that you could trade and get your team to be better.
Moving on to fantasy trades, don't give up on players having a rough patch, especially stars. This can happen all the time where people get off to a rough start or even in the middle of the season. Don't just drop them or trade them low because they're most likely to bounce back because of their track record.
Examples of this is like Marchand and also Stamkos, as they were sold very low, but they became very good players in the end, as they were one of the best fantasy players in the second half of the season. This is why you should not freak out when your player is not doing good, but also do freak out if it's been months and they haven't produced.
Tip number 2 is don't overvalue D in trades. You might panic and want your D to be fixed, but the fact is there only is a few Erik Karlssons or Brent Burns out there, and those players are really valuable, but if you're trying for lower than that, then it's not really worth it.
Especially in a league where there's stats that are left out like hits and whatnot. If like blocks is not high as it should be, then defensemen should not be a priority that you should be concerned with.
Tip number 3 is know when to cut trade talks, as you don't want someone to peer pressure you into making a trade you don't want to make by pestering you asking about a player. And this actually happened to me last year, as a guy was a Leafs fan and he was badgering me for Marner, and eventually, even though it wasn't too bad of a deal, I got pressured into trading a player I didn't want to trade, and I regret it.
Yeah, and this is your team, so you have the decision if to trade them or not. So if you really don't want to trade the person, just don't trade them. And also, if you realize someone is being too stubborn and like valuing the player really high, and you're going to give up a lot, and you're going to regret that too. Just cut the trade talks and move on.
Point number 4 for fantasy trades kind of relates to our draft advice of having players on good teams. So if you have a player that's on a bad team but has a good rep, I would advise to sell high on them early, because they're not going to be good consistently because they're on a bad team.
An example of this is when I had Doughty and Kopitar earlier of the year. Everyone expected LA Kings to be in the playoffs and to be a good team, but then all of a sudden they had a really bad year and they ended up being a lottery team. Sell those players early because they won't be much help later, and you'll get a good return earlier.
Tip number 5 for the fantasy trades is to trade for a linemate, as this can be really valuable. As you'll notice in the NHL, there's a lot of good duos in the league, like Rantanen and McKinnon, or Marchand and Bergeron, even lines. And if you just get 2 of them, if they connect on a goal together, you'll get way more points.
Also, a good reason to have those type of players, like, McKinnon, Rantanen, or whatever. It's like, say Saturday or Sunday, you're behind by like 30 points, and it's like they both have, that line has a good night. That will catch you up much faster than just individual expectations.
Lastly, as a bonus one, don't have too many players on the same team. As say you have too many players on Toronto or Boston or Pittsburgh, and that team is having a bad week, you're almost guaranteed to lose.
You want players that are spread out, not too spread out. Like we said, we want you to have duos or whatever and have line mates. But if you have too many players on the same team, like goalie, defensemen, wingers, and centers, then you will have 1 week you'll be really good and 1 week you'll be really bad. It's not consistent, and it won't give you a winning record, and won't be helpful in the playoffs, because eventually, unless they have a big hot streak, you're gonna lose at some point in the playoffs.
Thanks for watching the video. Hope you guys liked our tips on draft and trades, and hope you guys have a good fantasy season, and we'll see you guys next time.